Ken, thank you for that reading. Appreciate that. Before I get started, one quick announcement I wanted to make about our senior recognition that we normally have and the senior banquet, that kind of thing. So due to COVID and the difficulties that arise from being able to keep everybody safe and quarantined, or not quarantined, but social distancing that we struggle with as a group of people who love each other and like to be around each other, the decision has been made that we will not have a senior reception or banquet or anything of that nature this year. Now, in lieu of that, what the elders have decided to do is that we will be still having a presentation on Sunday night, August 2nd, with a Bible and a nice gift card for recognition that the seniors have had to miss quite a few things this year out, and that they normally would. So also with that, we recognize that many have already purchased maybe gifts for seniors, and you would still like to be able to give those to them, and that normally we have it set up where that's easy. So what we will do is we will set up a thing here at the building where you can drop off a gift if you've already purchased one or something for the seniors, and we'll make sure that they get to them. Also, we will post probably in one of the news lines, we will provide a address and contact information for our seniors so that if you do wish to do something for them, you can as well. And then Scott and I were talking yesterday, and we're going to try to set up a thing where we do have a small presentation like we would normally see, a video presentation for each of the seniors posted in a secure place on our website to be able to do something so that you can go and view that. We will have a small presentation, a video about less than 30 minutes that evening on August 2nd for those who wish to stay for that. What we do ask is that it is limited to the seniors and their immediate family or extended family that is there in addition to those who would normally be here. I think that pretty well kind of says what we're doing. We are trying to do something that is very good, and understand that during this time it's tough. We don't have an easy answer. There's not an easy answer, something that's going to make everybody happy. But we are trying to make sure that we do right by the seniors, and I believe that they have been and will be. So, and we will stream the video that will be presented on August 2nd that evening. Okay. Well, with that, given the fact that I just had to make an announcement like that about something like that, it throws into this fact that all around us we are in controversial times. Jeff talked about this last Sunday, but if you pull up the headlines today, I pulled up my phone and looked at the BBC News earlier, and all of the things that are going on in the world, not just in the U.S., but everything that's going on in the world, man, it is just, it's horrible, right? It is like you have to be on one side or the other. There's no in between. And everybody's upset with everybody else. At least if you read the news, that's what's happening. But isn't this a great time that as Christians we can let our lights shine? You know, if you read through the apostles and you look at Acts and the lives that they lived, and then you read what Peter and James, we'll talk about this in a minute, what they do and what they say, what is clear is they used every seemingly difficult opportunity as an opportunity to spread the gospel. Remember Paul in Acts 17? He gets dragged in front of the Areopagus. And this was not necessarily just a debate society. If you read the context, and if you understand the context of what was going on in Athens at this time, they were really bringing Paul before them to be tried for teaching something that was different than what they were ready to accept. Now, they got more than they bargained for, but he used it as an opportunity. This opportunity to defend himself. Because if you think about it, in Athens, about a couple hundred years before that, a man named Socrates was put to death for teaching a new religion. So Paul didn't approach this situation in Acts 17 as just, oh, I just had this opportunity to preach the gospel. He's approaching this as, I've got to defend myself, but you know what? Instead of being worried about myself, I'm going to be worried about what I can do with this opportunity. Letting our light shine. Usually in the most difficult situations, we have the biggest, the best opportunities to make a meaningful impact. During the easy times, it maybe not so much. But during these times, we do. There's no in between. You're either Republican or you're Democrat. You either support Black Lives Matter or you are against protests that destroy property, hurt others, or there's no in between. You can't fall anywhere and say that you support. You're either a Second Amendment supporter or a gun control advocate. You either support wearing a mask or you think it's a conspiracy. No in between. But I think the reality is that the majority of people in this country, the majority of people in the world, but particularly in this country, do not fall on those opposite ends of the extreme. Our media would have us believe that, right? They would have you believe that you have to be on one extreme or the other, and that neither of those extremes are tolerant of the other views, and that's probably true on the extremes. But I believe that most people fall within the middle somewhere. And they're looking, there's people out there searching and looking to see how Christians are going to behave. And maybe not just looking for Christians, but they're looking for some stability in their lives. They're looking for a right answer. They're looking for people who can put this controversy in perspective, or controversies in perspective, and rise above them. They're looking for people who do not consume themselves with everything that's going on around them, but they consume themselves with a spirit of love. They're looking for people who have hearts of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, who bear with one another and forgive one another because Christ has forgiven us, as Paul says in Colossians 3:12 through 17. Our world is searching. People are searching. Maybe we don't realize that, but they are. Anytime you have unrest, you have distress, you have people searching for stability, for hope in the storm. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be fantastic, awesome, that us as a people of God, us as Christians, us as a body of Christ, were folks that others could look to be an anchor in the storm? We should be people who know how to handle uncertainty in the storms of life. Turn back to Matthew chapter 5, or turn over there if you haven't already. And I want to reread what Ken read, and I just want you to think about this as we dive into this idea of us being lights, anchors, a lighthouse in the storms that are surrounding us here today. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on the hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives all light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's pretty simple, it's straightforward, and yeah, absolutely it is. But I want us to take a closer look and examine this through the lens of what was going on in the first century, to understand the context of things in the first century so that maybe it gains a little more meaning for us. At least it did for me. Maybe it helps us see things a little differently. You know, when we think about the Greco-Roman and the Jewish culture of the first century, in a lot of ways it was very different than what we face today. But in a lot of ways it maybe was the same in a kind of a principal way. Where it was really different, radically different, is in the social order of things, both in the Jewish and the Roman culture. In the Jewish social order, there was basically 8 classes of people. You could belong to the ruling elite, which would include people like Herod the Great and his immediate family. You could be a regional elite person, kind of like that were royal officials, large landowners, wealthy merchants, municipal elites who were governing officials, or they owned small land and less wealthy, but then you had governing officials and scribes and priests. You had a professional class of people that were merchants, fishermen, skilled laborers. Then you had a peasant class that was subsistence farmers and day laborers. A destitute class that included beggars and widows, disabled, the orphans, lepers, people that were the outcast of society. And then you had the slaves. You know, and people could move up in that scale within the Jewish culture depending on their financial situation, depending on how things went for them. But what is interesting is there seems to be, in the time of Jesus, a trend to pull people down and a downward trend into that. So when you think about that, then Jesus' words when he told the people to not be worried about things, but to seek first God's kingdom. Not to be worried about money, it brings a new light on that. Because people were continually being dragged down. In the Roman order, there was basically 6 classes. You had the senatorial class, which comprised the wealthy nobility. You had the equestrian or the knight class. This was a larger group of less wealthy Roman citizens, but included people like Pontius Pilate. You had the decurions, who were members of civil councils and leaders of local communities, kind of like Dionysius in Athens, who was one of the Areopagus officials that was converted in Acts 17. You had the plebeians, who represented the general citizenry of Rome. They owned small farms and shops, and Dorcas was probably in this class. You had freedmen or libertine who were ex-slaves but were typically dependent upon their former masters. And then you had slaves. And this was a strict hierarchical order that was usually inherited through family descent and gender. And while some could move up, it was often very hard because social ranking in that culture depended. Your social rank, it depended upon whom you could speak with and interact with. If you were at a higher class, you did not interact with somebody that was at a lower class. If you were at a lower class, there's no way you were going to interact and be able to rub shoulders with somebody at a higher class. Now, I want us to keep this in mind because it has a big bearing on how we read and view this idea of being light in the world. How we read and view Scripture when we understand what the people at that time were thinking when they were hearing these words from Jesus. You throw into the mix of all of this, the social norm of the day, according to Albert Bell, was not that the Greeks and Romans felt no responsibility for the poor. No responsibility at all. Today we have a responsibility. We feel that. I would say that it's probably ingrained mostly in our society because we live in a loosely Christian moral society. We have and feel a responsibility for those who are less fortunate. In the first century in Rome and Empire, that was not the case. It was not the culture of the time to do good for somebody just because that was the right thing to do. You only did good for somebody as if you could get something in return. And when you did good for somebody, you expected something in return, and they were expected to do that. That way it was a quid pro quo society, and that's how things worked. If I invited you to dinner and I had you to dinner and it was a big elaborate affair, well then the expectation was next week or sometime in the near future you would be inviting me to dinner as your guests. Oh, and by the way, the poor people, I'm not worried about them because you know what? That's punishment from the gods for something they've done. So I don't have to worry about them because they have their punishment. They're getting what they deserve. Because, they're not working. They're not doing anything to help themselves. They've gotten what they deserve. I don't have to worry about them. That was the society, the prevalent thought of the day. People wouldn't do anything unless they got credit for it. People wouldn't do anything unless they got something from it. Does that sound like sometimes what we experience today? Have you ever run across somebody who's not going to do anything or help anybody or be part of something unless they're the ones that are in the spotlight, they're the ones that get the credit for it? Think about the political and religious environment. In the ancient world, these two things were pretty much one and the same. They were different, but they were closely tied together. There was not a separation of church and state as we think about it today. Religious practices were part of statecraft, and political authorities took more than just a passing interest in what was going on religiously in their areas. Because failure to participate in a recognized state religion was unpatriotic. It's funny to me that sometimes we make failure to participate in patriotism unchristian. If we're not a firm supporter of red, white, and blue Republican that's in charge or whomever it may be, well then you're not a Christian. We make it a test of fellowship sometimes today. It was the opposite then. It was a test of your patriotism, whether or not you believed one of the gods and paid tribute to them. There is no religious identity separate from political or civil identity. Sometimes we as Christians are in danger sometimes of living this way today because we make our faith political. We make our faith about the politics of today or what's going on today. We put our stand there. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't take a stand for right, for wrong, that we can't be proud to be an American citizen. We can't be proud to be a member of this country, a citizen of this country. But guess what, guys? There are members and people of the body of Christ who are not citizens of the USA. And they are just as much our brothers and sisters as anybody who is a citizen in this country today. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that our faith is in God and not in who is president. Sometimes we lose sight of the fact that our faith must be rooted, grounded in the God Almighty, creator of the universe, and not in a political movement. Religion of that day was pluralistic, very pluralistic, but it was not tolerant. And this is seen at the many times that Paul was dragged away in chains because he was disrupting the local populace. So when we talk about this idea of the context, why does it matter? Well, let's consider for a minute Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and the things that he said there when we think about how rough the majority of Christians had it at that time. Because, by the way, the majority of people who were Jewish Christians of that day, while there were some that were wealthy and in the upper echelons of the Roman society and in the Jewish society, the vast majority of them were in the lower echelons. So that means there was such a great disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And Jesus spoke across the board to everybody. In verse 38 of Matthew 5, I want you to think about the context of if you were somebody in first century who had nothing. You were one of the lower classes. You lived job to job, day by day. What you earned in the morning, you used to feed your family at night. And oh, by the way, part of the reason that you were in that situation is because of the people who were in the classes above you were oppressing you. And some of the people that were not Christians, that were in the families in the higher classes of the Roman citizenry, were oppressing you. Now, with that in mind, listen to what Jesus tells them. But I say, you have heard that it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone would sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you. Okay, now understand this. Give of him who asks to you. Again, the idea in this, or the culture of that time was, I don't care about you as a poor person. Why should I care about you? I only care about people who can do something for me. Now, that's not too different than a lot of people in our society today. But Jesus is telling them, no, you care about that person, because if they ask you for something, guess what? You're to give it to them. Give to him who asks you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, here's a big problem. I'm a downtrodden, oppressed person in first century Jerusalem. I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, and my Lord is telling me to love my enemies and pray for those who are persecuting me. Is it so much to ask that today in our society, given what we have and the things that we have, that we stop and listen to others and give credence to what they're trying to tell us about how they're being treated? In light of what Jesus is telling people in the first century? We can't stop and give some credence to somebody who is saying, hey, I don't like the way I've been treated. He goes on and he says, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. Not just the good. And he sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Now here's where it really hits at home for these people. It says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? For even the tax collectors do the same. See, he realized that he lives in a quid pro quo society. He said, hey, even the tax collectors love those who love them. It's easy to do good to those who can do something back for you, right? It's easy to be with friends who are in the same socioeconomic class as us. It's easy for us to do things with people who look like us, act like us, think like us, vote like us. Not so easy when they don't quite look like us, maybe not smell like us, maybe don't have the things we have. If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? If you only greet your brothers, what are we doing? If we only greet the people that are in this building, are we really doing what Jesus wants us to do? Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. That was a big problem. Considering those issues, considering what the first century Christians were doing, Jesus was giving them ideas that were countercultural. Jesus was teaching a countercultural idea that could not be ignored. It could be accepted, it could be rejected, but it could not be ignored. And I think today we are in danger of being ignored as a people. Because sometimes, instead of standing for what is right with God, and standing as a beacon, as a light, as a lighthouse in the storm, we fall to one side or the other, and then we get mixed in with everything else. Jesus' ideas could not be ignored. His message and that of the apostles was one of faith, love, peace, hope, but it was also one of unity and helping their fellow man regardless of belief or class. It was not a message of calling out everyone with whom they disagreed on social media or somebody who they felt offended them. You know, the more and more I read the New Testament again and again, the more it's clear to me that Jesus and the apostles were calling people at that time and people today to be radically different than our society. You think about this hostile environment, and in this hostile environment of the first century where people were actively, physically persecuted and held down, and a lot of times it was the government officials that were doing it, Paul in Romans chapter 13 tells folks to submit to the governing authorities. Really? You're not saying I gotta get up and protest that my Second Amendment rights are being held back? Or I've got to protest that I don't like the way I'm being treated? No. What does he say? Submit. James goes on and says to people who were being physically abused and undergoing trials that we can't experience or can't maybe fathom today, to rejoice when they were going through those. Peter in 1 Peter 4 talks about not to be surprised when the fiery trial comes upon you. And then he goes on to say, not only that, but rejoice because you're getting to share in the sufferings of Christ. What's interesting to me is in each three of these situations, the apostle goes on later, whether it's Peter, whether it's James, whether it's Paul, and goes on to address issues of people getting along with one another within the congregation, within the church. Because you know what? When problems happen out there, they spill over into here and cause us to be at each other. And here's where it becomes so important and where we let our light shine. And I will end with this, with two things. But first, let me make clear what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we shouldn't stand up for what is right and what is moral. I'm not saying that we should not fight to defend Constitution or constitutional rights. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't take advantage of our rights as a citizen. Paul certainly did when he appealed to Caesar. But what I am saying is this, that we should not make our faith about politics, but about making disciples. And ask ourselves, do we spend more time mired in Facebook and the news than we do in study and prayer? What I am saying is that we look at principles and messages in the New Testament through the context of the first century Christians and then place that against the backdrop of today. And maybe we'll come to an understanding that we have a unique and great opportunity to shine as lights in this world. What I'm saying is that the Christians of the first few centuries didn't change the course of history by trying to change the government. They started with themselves first. They first changed their hearts. They loved each other to an extent that they were so countercultural that they couldn't be ignored. We want to change the course of history. We want to change the events of today. we have to start with our own hearts. We have to look at the speck in our eyes, or the log in our eyes, before we can look at the speck in our brother's eyes. We have to take a step back and go, wait a minute, maybe I am part of the problem. We might have to take a step back and say, you know what, I have not tried to truly understand what my brothers and sisters who are of a different race have gone through. And maybe I'm not going to understand. There's no way I can understand. But you know what? I'm not going to discount how they feel. I'm not going to set it aside and let it be muddied with some other obstacle, but I'm going to affirm that. I'm going to appreciate that they're going through and have gone through and continue to go through something that I will never understand. But because I love them, because of my love for God, I give it credence. Jesus called the people of that time that was very intense to be counterculture, and he calls us that today. And it hasn't changed. It's interesting, I was on my way this morning and a song popped on my playlist, How Sweet, How Heavenly. Most of us know this. And I got to wondering as I was writing in, I was like, I wonder when that was written. Because I bet it was written in a time where there was intense controversy, hatred, and discord happening in the world. And I was right. 1792. What was happening around that time? Well, there's these folks that had this loose confederation, right? And they were back and forth and arguing about things. They had just won independence, and there's still a lot of animosity between them and Britain. Oh, and then some of the music looks like it was set to music in 1844, or rearranged in 1844. What was happening in the U.S. at that time? Some intense hatred was going on, wasn't it? And in that intense hatred, these words were written. How sweet, how heavenly is the sight when those that love the Lord in one another's peace delight, and so fulfill the word. When each can feel his brother's sigh. When each can feel his brother's sigh. And with him bear a part. When sorrow flows from eye to eye, and joy from heart to heart. When free from envy, scorn, and pride, our wishes all above, each can his brother's failings hide and show a brother's love. When love in one delightful stream through every bosom flows, when union sweet and dear esteem in every action glows. Love is the golden chain that binds the happy souls above, and he's an heir of heaven who finds his bosom glow with love. When the world looks at us, isn't it great, and wouldn't it be great for them to see a light that shines through our interaction with each other, that shines in our understanding and appreciation for each other, a love that is seen in our communication with each other. In 1 Peter, the apostle writes something that I think is very, if we consider it in the context of when it was written and the people receiving it that were scattered all over the countries at that time, all over that region, and he's writing to them, and he writes these words, and I'm going to end here with these words in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 9. And I want us to think, and I would like for you to think back and just put yourself again in the place of somebody during this time. And see what these words mean to you and would say to you that we can apply to us today. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Why were we a chosen people, a royal priesthood? So that you may proclaim His excellencies, not proclaim the excellencies of whatever soapbox you happen to be on. Beloved, for you were once not a people, but now you are the people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you receive mercy. I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lust, which wage war against the soul. Now listen to this next verse, because this is so applicable to us today. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. I recognize that times are not easy. I recognize that maybe I've oversimplified things a little bit. And certainly that can be the case. But what I've hoped to accomplish this morning is for us to just take a step back and maybe consider things from a little bit different point of view. Maybe consider things from just, hey, what Jesus and the apostles were asking the people of the first century to do was countercultural, was life-changing, and was very drastic. We're not being asked to do something completely drastic, and probably not very drastic to how most of us live our lives right now, because hopefully we are living them in a way that does glorify God. That is, we're walking in a manner worthy of the gospel. But my question is, are there some little areas that we could change and adjust by looking at ourselves that really help to make that light shine to the world? Because at the end of the day, it's not about who is the next president. It's about, are we making disciples, church? That's the question. Are we reaching out beyond the walls? Are we making disciples? Or are we more worried about the political situation? You know, Jesus wasn't worried about a political situation, was He? He told them to love their enemies. You think when walk through the gates of heaven, as Ken was talking about earlier, you see Paul and Peter and James and John and others. You think they're going to ask us about and tell us a good job on our stance on Second Amendment or on political party? Or are they going to tell us, you know, I really appreciate the fact that you went without, you did without, so that others could do with, and so that others could have. Is our light shining? Hopefully it is. Hopefully we're people that can be looked to be lights in the darkness, anchors in a storm. May others see us and it be a sweet heavenly sight, because we love each other and we're reaching out, we're reaching up, and reflecting in. I'm not sure what your need may be today. Maybe it's that you've got a heavy heart. You've got something that you want us to pray for you about. We definitely will do that. And if you're online, you can text one of us, one of the elders, Kevin or myself. We would definitely be glad to pray for you. Be happy to pray for you. Consider it an honor. Maybe you're somebody here that needs to be immersed into the blood of Christ through baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. We stand ready to be able to help you to do that as well. Whatever your need, whatever your desire. If we can help you in any way, we ask that you come as we now stand and sing.